Still talking about Sudan's conflict. Meanwhile, despite ceasefire being declared between rival armies in Sudan, gun violence and attacks have persisted for a number of days now. Nonetheless, peace talks are underway in Saudi Arabia amid hopes that it will bring a short-term ceasefire. The preliminary talks will continue over the following days in the hope of reaching an effective and temporary ceasefire so that humanitarian aid can be delivered to those in need. And now to speak more on the Sudan war peace talks and the role of the African Union's effectiveness in resolving conflicts, we're now joined by the senior SAIIA researcher and political analyst from Johannesburg, and that's Gustavo de Carvalho. Thank you, Gustavo, for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, Gustavo, in your own opinion, what do you think is the root cause of a Sudan conflict and how exactly can it be resolved? We've seen several times that there's been a ceasefire that was not upheld. So how can this be resolved? And what is your take on the negotiations at large?
Navigating Sudan's conflict is quite a complex task because it requires us to understand what are those fundamental drivers of the conflict. And by doing that, we need to understand what are the interests of internal actors and external actors, but increasingly also understand what are some of the human rights implications. To a certain degree, we can see the conflict in Sudan as this long-standing part of political and social grievances, where we have different factions fighting for power, that are fighting for resource control, but increasingly also fighting for representation. So when we see in the recent years these disputes between our military and civilian factions, and inherently understanding what are the difficulties in achieving this transition from civilian rule to after years of military dominance is particularly important. But also when designing the responses, understanding that on one hand, we need to address that competition for power and resources and who is included within those processes, but also responding to the short-term needs of the population. We need to address the issues about the human rights violation, the attacks that are being done that are largely affecting civilians. So in that sense, we need to find that balance between what is happening with the negotiations that enable those political elites and military elites to actually talk to one another and increase the likelihood of a successful peace agreement, but not losing in mind on what is going to happen in the long term, especially if the root causes of the conflict are not addressed appropriately as part of this particular process.
Okay, speaking of the peace agreement and the negotiations, what would you say that international bodies are doing or have done to try and salvage the situation? And by international bodies, I'm talking about external powers like United States, Russia, and China. Have they played any role in alleviating this, or is there anything they're doing currently to stop it?
We certainly have seen a lot of attention given to Sudan in the last couple of months, and that certainly in a way it is somehow misleading because the crisis didn't start early this year. We already have had years of the political debacle that has actually created a lot of attention and concerns what is happening in the country. And unfortunately, I think for Sudan, we do see a country where it is right in the middle of global geopolitical disputes. We have countries like China, which is the largest trading partner of Sudan, and have those mix of strategic interests, part of them economic, part of them geopolitical, but also raises as many questions. What is the capacity and willingness of the Chinese to really become a driving force of political dialogue? We also have the role of Russia, which is at this stage quite uncertain of how much influential they are with the current regime, whether it's in terms of the well-notified presence of the Wagner Group and their exploration of gold mines in Sudan, but also a very close and a cozy interaction that we've seen after the fall of Bashir with the Russian leadership. The United States see that as a critical country within the region, and a lot of that actually reflects that Sudan on its own, it is an important crisis, but it to some extent has a degree of proxy elements to some of these global geopolitical disputes, whether it's in countries like China or Russia, the US, the European Union, Israel, countries from the Gulf. We see currently negotiations in Saudi Arabia, but a very important role played by the UAE as well. So to some extent, we do need to look into the internal dynamics, but also how that actually influences has a spillover effect in terms of how global powers are positioning themselves in their own competition for power influence.
Gustavo, now I would like for us to talk about the lessons that we can pick from. I mean, we've seen the Sudanese war, Mozambique and DRC. What are the lessons that the African Union can pick regarding their approach to conflict resolving and prevention, as well as management on the continent? What can they learn from this?
There is many lessons, and one of them is understanding what are some of the limitations that we have with the African Union. The African Union has been very vocal since the beginning of the crisis. It has suspended Sudan and has engaged in a number of discussions using its mechanisms from the Peace and Security Council, but also from its own member states, trying to find a space for negotiation and collaboration. Certainly, this poses many challenges. We've seen that for many years, including in the situation in Mozambique and in the DRC, that you do need a leading country or a number of leading countries that are willing to champion that situation for other member states. And I think what we see recently when it comes to Mozambique, a very important role played by countries like South Africa and Rwanda. But in the DRC, in the discussions in recent days, we also see that the Southern African Development Community and the East African Community playing a very important role into that, but also trying to find ways that on the one hand, we do not have that indifference to conflicts happening in the continents, but also that in order to be able to do that, we need much more political will from our leaders within the continents, but also a much more clear understanding on our capabilities. And that includes in terms of training, that includes in terms of the financial requirements that one needs to make sure that those interventions are successful. So certainly looking into the Sudan case, we do need to see in terms of a lot of the potential that the interventions in Mozambique and DRC have, but also a lot of shortfalls that we have within the continent of having effective conflict prevention and management structures from our international organizations.
Okay, thank you so much. Researcher, SAIIA, if I'm not mistaken, senior researcher, by the way, and of course, a political analyst from Johannesburg, Gustavo de Carvalho. Thank you so much for joining us on the news.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.